Good morning, everyone. I originally joined the London 2012 team in 2008, and I was initially responsible for the landscaping project. And it also gave me quite a good initiation to the actual park and how it was going to work. I've included the slide for the WBS. Obviously, we had a lot of major projects going on at any one time. There was a lot to be done. It was quite a confined space. We had 1,000 no's to our WBS, which the rest of the team will talk about how obviously we used that for the programme, but then also how we used it for the costs and contracts and how we used that for reporting. But it also gave us a sort of a common language across the programme and obviously across the work streams. The site was sort of broken up into 6 major areas, which were obviously utilities, structures, bridges and highways, enabling works, permanent venues, temporary venues, and obviously the landscaping. At any one time, there was obviously several different programmes in several different phases. We didn't have the timings where we could phase around the site. We had to literally be in every single area at any one time. So you could see straight away there were some major programme issues that we needed to deal with. The site was initially split into 600 LA areas. These obviously changed over time, but you can see the complexity on the actual site and how many little pieces of work that we had to manage. Some of those LA areas, some of them they would just experience one handover. We would go from enabling works over to the venues. But then some of the smaller ones around the actual site where the utilities and the structures and the roads were going, we could transfer those over 4 or 5 times. So they would go from enabling, they could go to utilities, they could go to structures, they could come back to utilities, they could then go to landscaping. So actually managing those works and how we dealt with that and how we dealt with those interfaces was absolutely key to the success of the programme. Obviously, from the word go, we had to deal with these issues. I've worked on other programmes before where actually we had a high-level strategic programme and we actually fed that down. But actually on this programme, it was key, obviously, that we approached the integration and we approached the strategic plan as one. By looking at that and actually having one sort of programme of truth, we actually had a critical path that we could work through the programme. Why did we need it? You know, with the scale of programme that we had and how big it was and how complex it was, we had to make sure we got this right. There's obviously lessons learned from other Olympics, and quite early on it became quite apparent that it was essential from some of the other delivery partners from previous games. Obviously, as I said, we had areas where we had to have venues and infrastructure working in parallel. There were key milestones that were driven from all the different aspects of work. It wasn't just, from a venues level, it had to include utilities and structures. Obviously, how we were designing the venues would lead to cross-LA workings. Obviously, the principal contractor areas, that was very important in how we addressed this. And then also looking at the fact that we didn't really want to have lots of contractors in any one space at any one time because it would just cause mayhem. CLM was fully accountable for the integrated planning. From a lower level planning detail, which is obviously what I did, it was really important that we had this overall integrated programme because it meant that quite quickly it would flag up any of our issues. You could address the flow issues, we could address any changes, any delays quite quickly. And rather than waiting till something actually went wrong, we could actually just assess through time actually where we were starting to experience delays, and we could see how it was going to impact other programmes going forward. The method. It was actually quite simple. There was no real rocket science to this. It was just a P6 programme that everyone bought into. We had planners that would look after their own projects, and then we'd have inter-project links. But obviously we had to make sure that we got it right. So we obviously established a very regimented reporting system. We had to understand all those interfaces. We had interface teams. We did a lot of work around our meetings and making sure we got those interfaces right and the right people were talking to each other. We obviously had to keep catching the timing of those and making sure that actually they were all happening in the right time and we weren't handing areas over too early to different contractors. And there was intensive tracking and monitoring. We were religious on how we looked after this integrated programme. The people, obviously, you need a good team of people when you're doing something like this. There wasn't hundreds of us. There was probably 15, 20 peak planners on the park that looked after the actual projects. And then we had an interface team which ran alongside them. But again, it was, a team of 5 or 6. I think what we did quite well is throughout the time, everyone got involved in interfacing. So you literally step in and step out. Obviously interfacing for the enabling works was very important when we were handing them over straight away. So we had a lot of enabling works interfaces happening at one time. So it changed over time. But we were regimented, we had people that policed everything that we did and made sure that it was happening in the correct order. I have to say it's odd when I look at this slide because it does seem so easy in principle. We had, obviously, how we had our Tier 1 contractors, which were absolutely key to making sure this integrated plan worked. So they had their own standalone programs, which included all our interface milestones. So we would advise them what went into their programs. What then I and my team would do is obviously take that information and feed it into our Level 2 CLM program, and that's where we had all the interfaces, the cross-interfaces across the program. What this slide probably doesn't explain was how difficult it was to get those Tier 1 contractors to obviously buy into our systems and buy into what we needed. You know, a lot of what we were asking was above what they had done before. You know, a lot of them didn't want to work in Primavera, a lot of them just were quite happy with their Astra and Microsoft programs. So we were asking quite a lot from them, and not all of them were geared up for it. So I think what we ended up doing, which was actually what was made it successful, is that we spent a lot of time, the planning managers, down with the Tier 1 contractors. We were embedded in their teams. You know, we spent a lot of time in their offices, guiding them and teaching them and making sure that they were doing it correctly. I probably spent the most amount of time on site actually with my Tier 1 contractors. So, and it was key to make sure if they got their programs right and if they had the right detailing, and then it all worked very well coming up. So, and it made it easier to assure it. It didn't work in all cases. I mean, I think I was probably just lucky or just very bossy, but it did come together in the end. And obviously that fed up to obviously a high level. So what were our program tools? We had the integrated register, which is based on milestones encoded by the LA areas in the park. We had critical paths. I mean, it was quite impressive, actually, to be honest, of a program of this magnitude, that actually at any one time you could actually go into a program and see what your critical paths were. And we did over time. We made judgments on that, and you could see, actually, how you were going through. And we did a lot around flow erosion and trends and looking actually how we managed that works. We obviously had the integrated logic, and we had program dashboards, which Gordon is going to talk about shortly. So time performance. So how do we measure how they were getting on, or how we were getting on? We couldn't obviously baseline all 27,000 milestones for the interface plan, so we took sort of 700 of the most important ones, the most important handover ones, and we put them through change control. And Gordon will talk a bit more about the reporting and how we ragged them and against how they were going on the project, but also how they were going from the overall program. The critical path, which was absolutely vital in what we did. And obviously the strategic plan, the high-level plan to make sure that we were hitting all those major milestones for test events and security lockdown. Lessons learnt. Effective integration requires a culture of excellent communications. Yes, I mean, we did. We worked hard at making sure that we worked well, obviously with our Tier 1 contractors and obviously how we fed to the ODA. We had a lot of meetings, but we evolved over time. We didn't just set out a structure of what we were going to do. Throughout the lifetimes of the programme, we changed, and we changed how we were going to run things. With the integration team, we had a centrally based one, but actually that wasn't good enough. We needed people on the ground that were working within the different teams, working with enabling, working with utilities and working with structures. So we moved people about and we changed them. And our original Level 2 programs that we baselined, for the first few months, we actually kept the logic correct. As we were changing logic in our day-to-day programs, we would then go back and change them through change control in our baselines. That just became an impossible task. So we kept the high level, obviously, the milestone data, but then we dropped actually trying to run the projects as well in the baselines. So that actually made it easier and gave us more time to concentrate on the job in hand. So I'm going to hand over to Gordon, who's going to talk more about reporting, and I think we're open for questions, both of us, after that.
So just before I go on to look at some of the tools and techniques that we used within program controls, I thought it'd be worth saying something on the objective and what we were trying to do. As program managers, it boiled down to making smart decisions. So program controls role was really to support that by getting trusted information to the right people at the right time. And I guess what's most important about that is what we weren't trying to do. So we weren't trying to create reports which created a record of the program. The reporting was designed to be useful at that point in time to decision makers, not necessarily something that would be read retrospectively by others to create a project history. It still left us with a challenge of how do you navigate the amount of information that was available to us with so many projects and contractors on board. And really what we tried to do there was apply what I would call a program lens. So the key question for us was, does it matter? Zoe's touched on the fact that we had a critical path, which meant we understood flow at a program level. So if we had a project which had 3 or 4 months float and it was running 2 or 3 weeks late, actually at a programme level, that might not matter. Whereas on the flip side, if we've got a project which has only got a couple of weeks float, and it's not forecasting that it's going to be late, but we can see from some of the underlying performance metrics that it's struggling to keep up the way where it should be, that does matter, and therefore that would be escalated into the reporting. One last thing to say in that is we used the project manager was the pivotal role between programme and projects, and we had a culture where project managers came to the programme and reported in a style which was, you need to worry about X because of Y, and I'm doing Z about it. And that created a very useful dialogue between programme and project where we could intervene where necessary and support where necessary. I've touched on the need to make decisions, and I've called them rules, but maybe guidelines is a better word for these. At a programme level, we looked at what was the latest responsible date for action. So we understood what was the backstop to our decisions. There wasn't any desire to manage with what we call the long screwdriver. We didn't want to intervene down at project levels, but we did want to understand when the decisions needed to be made by and to make timely decisions so that they were effective. We also used 80-20, and I think there are two key aspects to that. The first of them is because of the complexity, we realised that we couldn't do everything all of the time. So we had to know what was important and we had to focus on that, and we had to be conscious to not do everything. Equally for information, perfect information came too late. So our project managers and our decision makers had to be prepared to act on information that was good enough and not necessarily perfect. And Kenna mentioned in her presentation the immovable date. I think that the mantra at a programme level wasn't so much hit the date, but protect the float. So we always wanted to have enough float in the programme so that where events which were outside of our control happened, it didn't cause us undue grief because we had something in the programme that we could fall back on. In terms of the system itself and how we supported that, I think the key message was to be flexible. So whilst we had a project control system all the way through, actually it varied through time. So in the initial phase, we were very focused on design fixity and placing contracts. So we had project reports which were designed to say, have you hit these milestones, 0, 100 type milestones, you've just got to do these things. Once we got into construction, it became much more about critical path analysis, objective measures of progress, understanding where we were against the plan. And then at the back end, it became a lot about checklists. So did we know what were the snags, what were the defects, did we know what documentation we had to gather about not dropping the ball? And the reporting system evolved to support those different phases for each project. So different projects had different styles of reports depending on where they were in the life cycle. There's a lot to be said for keeping it simple. I think text-based reports where you get pages full of text, particularly if that's full of acronyms and project jargon that relatively few people understand, are difficult to assess. It's difficult for people to then help. We used a lot of graphic reporting and data analytics, so we analysed the information as it came through to the programme. We had to spend time up front, though, teaching projects how to do that analysis, so not to report that I'm overspent because I spent more money than was in the budget, or I'm late because I did slightly less than I planned to do, but actually identify what were the root causes that caused that, and then to take action to fix them. And the last one there talks about working to the same calendar. Graham and Mark will talk later about how we flowed some of our requirements down into the contracts. But broadly, we didn't specify how to do things, we specified what we wanted to deliver. The other thing we had to state was the time, so we had to specify when. It's probably easiest to show that by looking at the reporting structure. I think that's not an atypical structure for a programme of this size, where you've got a supply chain at the bottom feeding up through project management team within a delivery partner, and then onto the ODA and the government as client. On the left-hand side of that, I'm looking at the reporting, so the information which flows up. And the key points for us were the project status reports coming from the supply chain had to be prepared 10 days after month end. We then reviewed those at the delivery partner and client level, with their reports following another 10 days after that. So we had roughly 3 weeks to turn around raw data from the supply chain to a comprehensive programme report which went to government. To make that work, we had to source information at the lowest sensible level and rework it as little as possible. So the reports were designed to be modular, that you could lift elements of one report and put it into a report at the next level up. In parallel, we assured that information, so we talked about the need for trusted information. So where we've got assurance coming down the right-hand side, that wasn't about the client reworking data that was coming from the delivery partner, or the delivery partner reworking data that was coming from the supply chain. It was assurance and making sure that the data was valid and accurate for the reporting. Of course, we couldn't have made any of that work without the supply chain. And I think the key lesson for us was, whilst we had a comprehensive works information and we specified in detail exactly what we wanted, it only worked because we worked with the suppliers to enable them to provide it. And we found that across the breadth of the suppliers in the park, whilst we engaged with some of the biggest tier ones in the industry, there were a mix of experience and appetite for what we were trying to do, particularly if I take something like earned value, which wasn't widely used in the construction sector. Some suppliers had worked with it before and they were very comfortable. Others hadn't worked with it before, but they did want to develop that as a skill set and be something that they would use in the future. And there were other suppliers where, to be honest, they weren't interested. From our point of view, we didn't really want them to earn value. We wanted an objective measure of percent complete, and it was about understanding the supplier's needs and what they were trying to do and working with them so that at the programme level it worked for us and it worked for them. Just looking at the project information which we reviewed at the programme level, and the key document for us was the project status report. So this was the summary document prepared by each project every month, which we then reviewed, and what were called our implementation reviews. So these took place in the middle of week 2, which is what drove the 10-day cycle for projects to produce these. And it's structured to enable us to check the health of each project. The first page is prepared by the project manager, and it's there to highlight what are the key issues. So as I said against the first slide, it was designed to say, you, the programme, need to worry about X because of Y, and this is what we're doing about it. And that dictated most of the dialogue. The rest of the report is really designed to test and challenge that. It's very data-driven, and we wanted to make sure that we had multiple sources of information to find out where we were. So we had milestones and earned value and construction quantities, where we looked at how many cubic metres of concrete have you poured versus what you should have done, how many tonnes of steel, how many metres of cables, how many light fittings. It's all very objective measures to be able to assess where the project was really at, and then test that back against what the project manager was telling us in terms of how things were going. I'll touch a little bit more on the cost report later in terms of how we built up our cost model and priority themes we've already seen. We used earned value as our key measure of progress, and in terms of the system, I think the simplest way to say it is we had an ANSI compliant system. So as with most people, we followed the 32 criteria. I think what's interesting to touch on is where we, I'd say, de-emphasised some of those areas rather than varied from it. The first one was our approach to baseline. So where I think a typical system would talk about changes to the baseline being driven by required change to scope, required change to schedule, or required to change the budget, we took a more flexible approach. So we consciously decided that we wanted the baseline programme to reflect what was going on the ground. It meant that we lost some of the theoretical capabilities of earned value, where you extrapolate your SPI performance and see where you think you're going to get to, but it gave us more confidence in the plan. It meant we believed that contractors were going to deliver what they said they were going to deliver because we had a baseline that could be delivered. There was the question earlier on about how detailed were the baseline reports. Zoe touched on it briefly, but one of the lessons that we took from the programme were we had too detailed a baseline at the outset. So in the yellow book, we had too much information in the baseline. The logic links were contained in there. By the time we re-baselined the programme in 2009, after we'd placed the Tier 1 contracts, we brought that up to a higher level so that the baseline had the key interface milestones between projects, and it represented the programme critical path, but all of the actual logic was held within the forecast programme and not under change control. The other main area that we varied from ANSI standard was on the budget side. We didn't differentiate between budget and funding, so whilst we had very strict controls about how projects accessed additional budget, ultimately if a project overspent, then we had to add budget to that project. And if projects underspent, then we took budget off those projects so that the budget reflected where we were going in terms of cost. Similar to schedule, it meant that actually the budget tended towards the cost, so you got a CPI of 1 and you lost your long-term trending. On the plus side, though, it gave us a much more accurate view of what our budget requirements were and where we were going with anticipated final cost. So on the cost forecasting, Someone asked the question earlier about where did we get the contingency amounts from. On the left-hand side, our original budgets were built up from the base cost, which was largely based on historic costs, and then a quantitative risk analysis of what we believed the contingency budget had to be, and that was split into project, programme and funders. Through time, though, we became less dependent on that quantitative risk analysis, and we deployed what we called trends. This is where we took discrete risks that were becoming more probable and identified them within our reports, initially as an unsubstantiated trend, which was an event which we weren't certain was going to happen, and we didn't know exactly how much it was going to cost, but we thought it was going to happen, and we had a rough idea what its impact would be. So that started to get picked out on our cost reports as something that we could discuss each month. And whilst we tried to mitigate all of our risks, and particularly those unsubstantiated trends, for the ones which we couldn't, they then evolved to become an acknowledged trend. And really that was a precursor to change. By the time an event became an acknowledged trend, we thought it was going to happen, and we thought we knew how much it was going to cost. And where I think that was important is we didn't get very many surprises in the change process. So when we had our change board, there weren't very many changes that came forward that we didn't know about as a programme. There weren't fait accomplis being presented that we hadn't heard about before, because we'd gone through this structured approach to how risks evolved through trends and then ultimately into changes where we couldn't mitigate. So touching on change control, we had a monthly change board which authorised any additional budget. Having said that, there were delegated authorities, so typically project managers would have up to £250,000 of delegation. It meant that people could make day-to-day decisions, and then those were notified to the change board, but didn't actually need approval. If you needed more than £250,000 of project contingency, or if you needed to access the programme or funders contingency, that was approved at change board, with the latter two also going on to government for their authorisation. So we ended up with the dynamic system where we started with the baseline at the top left, and each month we compared that to the forecast. Where we saw variances, those became trends, and trends informed the change. And once the change went through, that updated the baseline. I think one thing worth saying on the change board is it wasn't intended to be a forum for bad news. So this wasn't intended to be where you went to just because you needed more money or because the milestones were slipping. Actually, what we wanted to do were to approve changes which were a different way of achieving the goal, rather than just shifting the goal to the right. So on the lessons, I think I've managed to touch on all of these as I've gone through, apart from the top one. And really what I want to say on that is we didn't do anything desperately innovative. We didn't come up with any one thing that hadn't been done before, which was the single bullet. We just did the basics consistently well. We had timely information, which we trusted, and our decision makers acted upon it, and that helped us drive programme. Thank you.